Recording this point. Yes, Yofi. Okay. So Shavuot Tov, everyone. It's lovely to see so many people. And Shavuot Tov, I was asked to say Arthur instead of Rabbi Waskow. So Shavuot Tov, Arthur, thank you for joining us. It's a great honor and it's a great privilege. And it's lovely that you're able to join us and teach today. Just for those who didn't see the email, and just so we know, a few things. So Arthur Waskow founded and is the director of the Shalom Center and is the author, editor and author of about 20 books on public policy, on religious thought and on practice. And I would also say he's a great inspiration for many younger Jews and many generations of Jews on both of these things. He's also taken a vigorous part in public advocacy and nonviolent protest on behalf of peace, civil rights, full equity for women, gay people, freedom for Soviet Jewry, and healing for the wounded earth. So many of these things are very relevant for us today and at this time. So I'm very grateful that you're able to come and join us. So before we'll be talking about chapters from this new book, from the new book, Dancing in God's Earthquake, The Coming Transformation of Religion. And I have it, and if people want to purchase it afterwards, we can make a group purchase for the shul, and I think that would be easier for all of us. But I did want us to start off by tasting a bit from this book and understanding why this is important and what this is about. And I'll just put this in context of some of the learning that we've been doing over the past few months. And Stephanie, who is here, Stephanie Brown, who is our VP Education, put together this a 3-session study series on alcohol, sex, and drugs in Jewish tradition. And this is the sex part, okay? We already did the alcohol and the drugs. We had a tasting session for the alcohol, not for the drugs. Sadly, that wasn't possible. But this was all very enjoyable and it's all very interesting. But beyond the fact that it's a nice Havdalah theme, we had it was really important for us to go into this because the idea was to explore and trace out where our religious tradition, our Judaism, should turn to a more embodied practice, okay? So it's not just clickbait, it's mamash to check out where we need to go into a more embodied practice in order for our religion to be more meaningful for our generation and for future generations. So, and we'll probably talk about, being disembodied today a bit and how that is not good for us in a religious sense. Last time, I want to remind those of you who were with us last time, we started touching on the idea of passion as a missing ingredient in our religious life. Okay, not least in Reform Judaism, the idea of tshukah, of passion, of religious passion, of passion in general. And the question is, how can we recapture this inner fire of our tradition going forward, not going backward? Okay, going forward, how can we recapture this idea of passion? So Rabbi Waskow, or Arthur, when we asked you to join us for this meeting and teach, we were hoping that your work, which is earth-based and humanity-loving, would be a very good Torah to learn on these subjects. So the floor is yours. We'll move to you. I have questions. I encourage people to collect questions, either put them in the chat or you tell us how you want us to do this. If you want to talk and then we ask questions or so I'm moving this on to you.
Okay, so thank you. And Shalom Aleichem to all of you. So there are two places where especially Christian tradition, but not entirely, has really distorted the notions of sexuality in biblical tradition. One of them is the end of the story of the Garden of Eden. The story has been taken in much of Christian tradition drawing on Augustine of Hippo, who was totally freaked out about sex, and who decided that the original sin of Eden was sex, and that though he agreed that the act of sex had to happen in order to preserve the human race, it ought really not to be understood as pleasurable or experienced as pleasurable. And it ought not to be ever experienced for anything except preserving the human race, that is, for procreation. And so all kinds of sex that weren't procreative, he thought were terrible. He drew on some things that were in Torah, but he made them central. And for example, there is a prohibition on male homosexuality in Torah, but instead of looking at what might be transformed about that, he wanted to underline it and lift it up as central because it didn't lead to procreation. And so you got a very powerful energy in some, not all anymore, but some of Christianity forbidding gay and lesbian sex, all sorts of other sexuality that wasn't oriented to having more kids. But I don't think that's what the Garden of Eden story was about. There was a big mistake in it, but I think the mistake was not about that. It was about gobbling up all the abundance. I think the voice in the garden said, there is enormous, wonderful, joyful abundance here. A little self-restraint from the human race, one tree, just as a symbol that you don't gobble it all up. And the human race decided to gobble it all up. I think that was a big mistake. And yet, even that mistake was an act of growing up. In fact, I think that mistake, I think the story of the snake and that mistake had a growing up aspect to it that even our tradition, which never thought it was about sex, didn't fully understand. There are the two lines, and they are about sex. There are the two lines in the story of the garden, in which one line says the male and female partners of the human race were both arum, meaning naked, and they weren't ashamed. Well, that's typical about children. The next line says the snake was the most arum of all the beasts of the field. And then it says the snake went to Eve and convinced her to eat from the tree. Now, every translation I know says that the second arum, that says the first one was naked. And the second one, the very next line, it says that wasn't naked, that was clever or shrewd. And I looked at that as a writer and said, come on. What writer uses the same word, it's spelled the same, it sounds the same, uses the same word 2 verses in a row, and doesn't mean you to pay attention that they are the same word. So I tried out in my head, the snake is the most naked of all the beasts of the field. And I wondered what that meant. And what came to me, it seemed obvious, was that the snake is the most naked because the snake sheds its skin. What could be nakeder than that? Shedding your skin. And then I asked myself, so why would that be so important for the writer to make a point of it? And why would the snake make the point, would the writer make the snake of the point that the snake is the nakedest of all animals, and then start the story about going to Eve? And what came to me was a whole little conversation between the snake and Eve. That's the way Midrash works. The rabbis taught that the Torah was not written in black ink on white parchment. It was written in black fire on white fire. And you got to learn to read the white fire, the blank, what seems blank, just like you got to learn to read the black fire, the ink. So I tried reading the white fire, the blank part. And what came to me was this, that the snake says to Eve, you know, I shed my skin, and you would think that I would die when I shed my skin, but I don't. I'm transformed. I grow up a whole new stage when I shed my skin. The voice told you you would die if you ate from the tree, but it's not true. You are about to turn from a child into an adolescent, and you're going to shed your skin. It might even feel like you were about to die. You're even going to bleed when you shed your skin once a month, but you're not going to die. You're just going to be transformed from a child into growing toward being an adult. And it's not true that you'll die if you eat from the tree. So what you will do is grow up, and you'll grow up as a girl turning into a woman. So Eve thought that whole business was very interesting about shedding her skin and bleeding and growing up. So she ate from the tree. And she did grow up. Sometimes we know that, first of all, we know that adolescents need to grow up and do something, be someone different from their parents. If they only imitate their parents, they don't grow up to be their own selves. And she did. And we know that sometimes adolescents make mistakes when they do that. And she did, I think, make a mistake. I wish that she had looked at the tree and said, you smell wonderful and you look delicious, but I don't need to eat from you. I don't need to gobble up all the abundance of the garden. I want to celebrate from you and with you. I want to dance around you. I want to sing a song about how delicious you smell, how delicious you look. I don't need to gobble you up. But she didn't. She made a mistake. Now, it was a big mistake because that mistake meant that we learn at the end of the story two things. We learn, first of all, that the abundance vanished and that we were going to work very hard every day of our lives just to get enough food to eat, because the earth was only going to give forth thorns and thistles. And the second thing we learned was that hierarchy was going to come into the world, and that women were going to obey men. Now, the first of those, nobody thought it was a command, so that men were not allowed to invent rakes or hoes or harvesters. They weren't allowed to create tools that would make it easier to work. Nobody thought that. But people did think, at least men thought, that the second thing that women were going to obey men was a command. They weren't commands, neither one of them. They were both consequences, and they were consequences that human beings were intended to transcend. They were intended to grow beyond those consequences. In the book, I talk about how the coming of manna after Pharaoh brings plagues on the earth, just like a well-known American president recently who worsens a plague and brings many. By the way, he behaves. After that, and the Pharaoh drowns in the Red Sea, or the Reed Sea, comes the manna, again offering a universe that's abundance. And it also says, this story, which is a parable, like the first story, a teaching story, says, yes, you do have to restrain yourself, just as we tried to teach you in the story of the garden. But the restraint that you need to do is the coming of Shabbat. And that's not giving up something delicious. It's having something delicious. And we begin to invent ways of treating the earth with care that's both self-restraint and delicious. And then we go to the seventh year, which is a time of self-restraint, which is also delicious, like Shabbat. So the whole story in Jewish tradition is not about giving up sex. It's not about treating sex like it's terrible, except for having children. It's delicious. And we learn how to make it delicious. And Shabbat, we say, not, you can't have sex on Shabbat, but yes, Shabbat is a time to have delicious sex and enjoy it.
Can I ask you a question? I just want to go back for a moment because I have many questions and this is going to be one of them. And if other people have questions, please jump in. But I want to go back to the nakedness, the arum. And I was wondering in our times, because if the idea of going back to Eden or kind of recreating a form of Eden, a place of joy, is also maybe reconnecting to the place of arum, of nakedness. So first of all, what are the things you think we need? What's the skin we need to shed in your mind now for us to be able to go back and achieve this place of arum?
Well, it's basically creating an ethic of love instead of an ethic of domination. One of the stories I retell in the book is based on a teaching in the Torah, which is a crucial teaching, but it has a question. What does it mean? Not so obvious. It's the creation story, which says that human beings are created in the image of God. So in the Talmud, there's an answer to the question, so what does it mean, the image of God? In the Christian Gospels, there's an answer which draws on the Talmud to the question, what is the image of God? And about 11 years ago, I asked that question of my then 8-year-old grandchild, my oldest grandchild, 11 years ago, what does it mean? I said, we read this morning. We were visiting where she lived. I said at that time, she understood herself and we understood her as a girl. She grew up 11 years later. She is calling herself beyond the binary. So she's a they, and they wanting to see that as retroactive. So I'll call her they in this story, though at the time she was a girl. So they, I said, what does it mean, the image of God in this teaching of Torah? And they said, what's an image? And I said, well, like a photograph. And they said, photograph? That's really strange. God is invisible. How could there be a photograph of God? And I didn't say a word in the rest of the conversation after defining image. I just waited while they had the conversation essentially internally. It was a wonderful conversation. And then they said, so there could be photographs of human beings. Maybe it's the other way around. Maybe God is in the image of human beings. Long pause. They said, but we're all different from each other, and it couldn't be just one of us picked out to make the image of God. So that wouldn't work. Long pause. Well, we are different from each other. Their face lights up and they say, maybe we're different from each other the way the pieces in my jigsaw puzzle are different from each other. You got to fit us together. And if you fit us together, we make a community. And a community is more like God. I thought that was one of the best pieces of Torah I learned this whole 50 years from an 8-year-old kid. And it's an ecological story. Ecology is the teaching that it's crucial that every species is different from the other species because then they can fit together to make an echad, to make a one, to make an ecosystem. And I never thought of a puzzle like that, a jigsaw puzzle, as a kind of ecological game, but it is. It teaches the same thing. And I began to think about thinking of the world as a great ecosystem, not just biologically, but culturally and politically and socially, as a great ecological system. And I began to be unhappy about Melech, king, and Adonai, Lord, as ways of describing the universe. Those names of God are really ways of thinking about the world. And I also had discovered the ancient name of Yud He Vav He, YHWH in the Western alphabet. It had no vowels, so it wasn't Yahweh, which has 2 vowels, or Yehovah, which has 3 vowels. It was just YHWH. And one day I tried pronouncing it without the vowels. And what came out was, I'll try to lean close to the mic here, and maybe you can hear it. Just a breath. And I thought, oh, now that makes sense. The real, well, at least one of the real names of the real God shouldn't be just in Hebrew or Egyptian or Chinese or Latin or Greek or English or Russian or Swahili, but in all of them. And the only thing, the only sound that's in every human language is just breathing. And the second thing that came to me was, Waskow, it's not just human languages. Every living being on the planet breathes. And we don't just breathe in a little bubble, we interbreathe. Every tree, every bush, every grass breathes out oxygen. And we animals, including humans, breathe in the oxygen and we breathe out CO2. And all those plants breathe it in. The whole life process of the planet depends on interbreathing. And so that's also what's in crisis right now. We've invented ways of breathing out too much CO2, not breathing it out from bodies, but breathing it out from machines, so much that all the trees and grasses of the world can't turn it back into oxygen. So too much CO2 builds up and it heats up the planet, and that's what we call the climate crisis. Too much CO2 heating up the planet. So what we call the climate crisis is really a crisis in God's name. And given the level of the crisis, that's not surprising. So I don't know where that went back to, but it started with the whole question of how you understand the deepest questions of what the world is and whether it really is based on bossing each other around, bossing the planet around, men bossing women around, or whether it's based on the jigsaw puzzle of fitting together.
I want to stop here and see if somebody else would like to perhaps ask something or if there's questions. And while you are thinking of it, while people are collecting their thoughts for questions, I just want to, your talk now, your conversation now about the ruach, the breathing, brought back the image of the ruach Elohim, the spirit, the ruach of Adonai walking around in the garden after they, after the story of Chava and the snake. And it's again one of these, and now I understand it in a different way from usually through your talk about God's name being in the breath, in the wind, in the air. It's almost like the story of Har Sinai when they hear the sounds, they hear the sound of God through the wind, but it's almost, and it goes back to the being naked thing. It's also a touch. They can hear Adonai through their body, through their skins of their body. So if we manage to attain a place of arum again, that you were talking about, the Nachash and Chava, it's also our ability, our wider ability to feel God's breath on all of us.
Right.
So thank you. Yeah, that's a. So do people want to? Questions?
I think the story of the Song of Songs is the story of the Garden of Eden for a grown-up human race, where Mama, Papa, God is not around giving orders anymore because we've internalized it. We've gotten the ethic of love for the earth, the ethic of love for each other. we're not afraid of our room anymore. In the, in the Song of Songs, there's a celebration of nakedness of the male body and the female body. And it's all in the context of loving the earth and loving each other. So sex becomes not the goal, but the process by which love can be experienced. I don't think the song, I mean, Jewish and Christian and Muslim tradition saw the song as not about the body at all. It's really about the Jewish people and God, or Christ and the church, or the Islamic adept in Sufi thought and God. And it's interesting, the Sanhedrin, which voted that the Song of Songs was sacred, also voted to prohibit its being sung in what we would call nightclubs. So I think they wouldn't have prohibited that unless it was being sung in nightclubs. So I think that they couldn't get that spirituality and sexuality were intertwined, that you didn't have to say, oh, it's got to be one or the other, but that they could both be part of it. And I think that the song was, in the Bible, it's the ultimate growing up, that what begins in Eden, the growing up from babyhood to childhood to adolescence, and then to a kind of hardworking adulthood. The next stage is an adulthood that's not consumed by work, but is playful and loving. And that doesn't happen until the Song of Songs.
So you talk in the book, and I've heard you also talk in other instances about the place that joy needs to take in our religion. Yeah, joy as a spiritual or as a religious practice. And you talk here in the book about the ethics of love. So I was wondering if you could perhaps say something about ethics of joy, or even if you could imagine a halakha of joy. If you want, you can take it to either direction or both, but I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think Shabbat is the Jewish attempt to make joy the heart of the tradition. Some people take it as very rigid, but I think that the real attempt of the creation of Shabbat is that it's about joy, it's about song, it's about lovemaking, it's about thoughtful reconsideration of our lives, but from the standpoint of caring, from the standpoint of chesed, of loving kindness. And every seventh year, the Shabbat Shabbaton, Shabbat to the exponential power of Shabbat, you might say, Shabbat extended, is the way of honoring and protecting and healing the earth. And not only the earth, the seventh year became the time when debts were annulled, so that the society was healed from some people getting rich and other people getting desperately poor. So it was a way of scrubbing the disabilities and starting fresh. And I think we need to be doing that. something like it. I mean, it'll be different because a post-industrial society is different from, and the whole planet are different from a tiny little sliver of land on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean. So we need to be thinking about midrash that takes that difference into account. But I think the teaching, the heart of the teaching was really crucial. So there's something on the chat box from about the Shemitah, but I couldn't read the whole thing. Maybe Robert, whoever Robert is, can say something about that.
Robert, do you want to say your question and expand on it, maybe?
First, you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, Robert needs to unmute.
Yeah, so we've been studying Shemitah with Gila, and in one of the chapters that we read from your book, you seem to be saying that the Green New Deal is sort of a modern implementation of something like the Shemitah idea. But do you think anything, a more literal approach to reviving Shemitah is feasible, or is that just too much of a fundamentalist impulse?
Well, I do think there's one thing about the Shemitah that is not carried out by the Green New Deal the way people have been talking about it that we might pursue. And that is a very local, maybe agricultural, maybe not agricultural. The thing I like about the Green New Deal, the reason I think of it as a modern version of the Shemitah, is that it's both social justice and ecological sanity, and which I think the Shemitah is. But I've been thinking a lot about what it would mean for congregations, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, other, to become, to set up, to create, as part of the congregational commitment, a solar co-op, a solar energy co-op, where not just the congregation itself and its own building, but the members of the congregation work together to solarize their own homes, their own apartments, even where their homes are not pointed in the right north-south direction, which mine isn't. I was able to find a solar co-op in Philadelphia that we could join so that the energy that comes into our home comes from that rather than from burning coal. And the point about the co-op is that a co-op can be a group of people who aren't limited to simply saving the money, which they would save from electricity that becomes, after about 5 or 6 years, maybe in the 7th year, becomes practically free. If once you've taken care of the initial cost of the solar implants, you might say. So that's one aspect of, I think, dealing with energy the way the Shemitah deals with food, that you're letting the earth rest and you're not forcing it to work the way our present use of coal and oil makes it work, overworks it. The other is actually beginning to happen more and more in a number of congregations. That's an organic garden, which the congregation shares with people in the neighborhood who don't have enough nurturing food to eat, and who can create a garden of justice as well as a garden of food. So in our generation, energy is food. When our folks were farmers and shepherds, food was the way you related to the earth. And I think that's why we came up with the whole pattern of kosher practice, because if food was the way you related to the earth, there should be a sacred way of eating food. If energy is what you also take from the earth, then there should be a sacred way of taking energy from the earth. And I think that using renewable energy in a local way, in a way in which your friends, your congregants, the people you are with, who you see as your community, is doing that together, is an important way of doing it. So I would say that, and I would even say the next holy time that we're coming up with is Hanukkah. We're about to enter Kislev, and Hanukkah comes at the darkest moment of the month. The month, it's a lunar month. The word month is really month, and it comes at the darkest time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. I would say, and it's one of the things it's about is conserving energy, right? 1 day's olive oil served 8 days' needs. So I would say Hanukkah might be a good time for your congregation to begin the process of creating a solar co-op. And the co-op could celebrate, the co-op could be a political body to urge your provincial government and your federal government to go further, etc., to go further to protect the earth, both in terms of food and in terms of energy. So I think that might be a great way to begin getting ready for the next Shemitah year, which starts the fall of 2021.
So just to follow up, I heard two things in what you said in this idea of a solar co-op. One is the community building aspect of it, and the other is the decentralizing aspect of it, the localizing. Right.
And third, of course, is saving the planet.
Yes, but the economic localization could be extended to much more than just the energy sector.
Yes, exactly. Right. It could be the communalization and the democratization of crucial elements of our lives, energy, food, and perhaps other elements as well, including the dog.
Okay, thank you, Robert. Toda. Yeah, and the Shemitah is actually a really interesting, it's an interesting conversation. And it's funny in the story, I keep going back to Chava here and your the focus we have on Chava and the corporal relationship we have in Torah between the way that Chava was actually supposed to be called Adama, right? Because they have the play on words Ish and then Isha, man and woman, but his first name was Adam, so her first name should have been Adama, which means earth. And so actually the whole story here is about our relationship with the earth originally and our physical relationship with the earth. So that ties into each other. So apart from Shabbat, I am going back. I will press on the question of joy. Why do you make joy a center? Why do you make joy a center of our practice?
Because people enjoy it.
But why would joy? I mean, because we have traditions of, attaining higher spiritual places, not through joy, but through other practices. But why do you put joy? What do you think? What kind of, if we go back to energy, what does that bring to us?
Well,
what will we gain?
I think love and joy are deeply intertwined. If we are to achieve an ethic in which love is the heart of how we behave toward each other, toward the earth, then joy is a necessary part of it. Sukkot, we're told, is the season of our joy. I built a whole book about the seasons, plural, of our joy. Sukkot is the fulfillment holy day. It's the fulfillment of the moon. It's in the seventh month, the seventh moon. It's the full moon festival. It's the harvest festival, the harvest not only of food, but the harvest of history. It's the traditional Messianic festival. It's the festival, Moses said that the Sukkot that comes right after the Shemitah year, the people were to assemble, they were to assemble the entire people, and they were to renew their connection with the Torah right after, during the festival of joy, so that the Torah was not supposed to be renewed out of grumbling and forcible, oh, well, it says we should do this stuff, I guess we'll have to do it. But it was to be renewed out of a sense of joyful celebration of the earth and each other in a moment of openness. When I wrote Seasons of Our Joy, the publisher told me I had to have a glossary for Hebrew and Yiddish words. So I wrote a glossary. And when I came to Sukkah, I wrote hut with a leafy roof. When it came back from the printer, it said hut with a leaky roof. And I looked at that and I said, wow, that's God's typographical correction. And I left it. And it still says, 40 years later, it still says hut with a leaky roof. And I think the point is that it's important that it's leaky, that it's open, that it's the way we get in touch with the earth. It's the holiday in which we most get in touch with the earth. So I think when Moshe said, that's the moment every seventh year when you've actually done letting the earth rest and celebrating it and sharing the free, the text says in Leviticus 25, the text says, you can eat what is a Shabbat produce, of the earth, what grows freely. Well, you haven't made the earth grow, but what grows freely you can eat. then the whole people can come together and take joy in the Torah. So all that says to me that that we're supposed to put that at the heart of what we do. And a whole different attitude toward sex, I think, is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And toward love is part of that.
Thank you. It's getting quite late where you are, so I'm just wondering if people have questions, if there's something people would like to ask or clarify, or just a thought that came to you here, so we can collect some thoughts.
I've been personally studying and trying to learn Chinese on my own, and one thing that comes up with the word adma, which means nakedness, is in Chinese there are certain words that have multiple meanings. I say words loosely because it's more characters, and when you learn Chinese, you learn the pinyin, which is the basically Hebrew transliteration of the character. So there are certain characters with multiple meanings, and then there are certain pinyin, which is the correct how you pronunciate the Chinese character, that overlap. There's pronunciations that overlap. So it's that kind of whole idea that popped into my head when we were talking about Adma, and was like, okay, maybe it's something more along the lines of what you see in Chinese when you try to learn it from an English perspective.
I really love, Gila mentioned the Adam and Adama. I really love it because in English you talk about the environment. Well, the environment means it's in the environment, it environs, it's out there somewhere. But Adam and Adama is like this. It's intertwined. And that's what's the truth, is that human beings and the earth are intertwined. And it's not like, oh, it's in the environment, it's out there somewhere. So I love that the Hebrew is telling the truth in the words about the way the relationship really is. And it's interesting and funny that the word Adma is in the Chinese.
Thank you, Miranda. Tada. Any other thoughts that we can bring into this here? Unless you all want to think about it, and then we can maybe talk about it at another point after you've had time to sleep on this.
I'm a little bit curious about this idea of the ethic of love and the ethic of joy. Because when I think of an ethic, like I think of a code of conduct, like a very practical thing that you can follow. So I'm really curious. I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to what specifically the ethic of love and joy look like, because yeah, I'm super curious about that, because I feel like when I think of how we create policy and how we create law, like those things aren't often taken into consideration, I don't think. So I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, it's been said that justice is love in public. That's a beginning of attempt at it, but I don't think it goes far enough. If you took the image of the jigsaw puzzle and you treated it seriously, and you said, okay, we are each different. How do we take that difference honorably, joyfully, seriously, in a way to fit ourselves together, asking at each moment, what is it that your difference can contribute to my dignity, and what in my difference can contribute to your dignity? How do we write law to make that possible? Rather than writing law that says you got to do what I am telling you to do. That would be the way in which I would try to go about doing that. People have been working on a legal system that would be, I can't remember now the word for it, but that would be not retribution, but healing. It would assume that with almost everybody, what we need is a way for people to restore, restorative, or even better than restore, of a healing system of justice in which people who have done damage not only restore it through contributions of money, but contributions of work and contributions of honor. The whole notion of of reconciliation. Somebody put that in the chat box, thank you. The whole notion that people may have caused damage because of damage that was done not only to them, but maybe even to parents or grandparents. There's been a lot of research recently about the effects of trauma, even in the genetic system, going back a couple of generations. What has been the effect of the torments that people suffered in the Holocaust on their grandchildren, and in the torments of slavery on their grandchildren? How do we deal with that? Again, the question of the fitting together of people who have suffered and sometimes caused suffering because they suffered. How do we address that? How do we examine it and address it? So I don't have specific answers. I think we're just beginning to try to understand what it would mean to have a society like that. But I think that the questions are already pointing in a very different direction. And I think we can learn from ecology as a biological science to begin asking how the jigsaw puzzle works in human society as well as in our relationships with the earth.
Okay, any other, and so yeah, thank you for that question. So any other questions or thoughts?
I did begin in the book to examine the question of what do we need to think in terms of the Shemitah, for example, of the pulsating economy, not an economy of infinite growth. I don't think the planet can stand an economy of infinite growth. the Shemitah said we can grow an economy in terms of more efficiency, etc. And then we have to give it away. Think of the Buddhist tradition practice of creating a sand portrait, and then brushing it away so that it goes back to nothingness. That's one aspect of the Shemitah. And that it doesn't destroy creativity, it just renews creativity. So that's another, and I talk about what that might mean in economic terms, macroeconomic terms. So I hope you'll look at that as well.
בסדר. טוב. So I think I will wrap this up for tonight, unless Stephanie, you have something to, Ola.
I wanted to thank you for this reminder of joyful renewal. I think especially when, as we are entering winter and things are dying, that reminder that there will be a renewal. And I think in relationships as well, that idea of there will be good times and there will be bad times, but this sort of cycle, you can't renew without there being something that is difficult. And I think that idea of something of joyful renewal is very powerful and very hopeful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, thank you, Ken. Yeah. So it's funny, it's like we sort of touched, like our theme today was, sexuality and sex in Jewish tradition. We touched on this, but we touched on many other things, and thank you, but I think they all touched on the same, it's like we have a point in the center of a circle and then all these points around it, holding the circle. Going back to this, because I think reimagining and redefining and recreating not just a healthier sexuality in our culture, in our societies, but also in our tradition, and a healthier tradition and religion and spirituality all go hand in hand, and they're all sitting on this connection to the earth and to the original story of our relationship with the earth and our relationship with our body, on the Spirit of God, on the wind of God touching our body and touching ourselves and how we react to that. And I love that you brought in Sukkot, which is such an important festival relating to our body and to sexuality and to joy, and tying all of them together. And I think they illustrate each other and they inform each other in a very important way. So what I can see us taking from, one thing that I can see us taking from today's talk, and thank you again very much, Arthur, I find it very difficult to say that, but beseder, is that we have this container full of these thoughts, and they all connect with each other. The way we treat our bodies and the way we treat the earth, we know are connected. But all of this is connected with our, not just our secular ethics, but also our religious ethics. And not just our religious ethics, but also the way we approach our spirituality. And that's why I came back to your idea of joy once again and again, is because I think our ability to approach this in joy, create and I will say a halacha of joy, because that's my pet, my pet thing that I need us to make is will be a huge revival for us, I think. And so thank you for sharing these thoughts. Toda rabah.
Well, thank you all. I love the openness of our neighbor to the north. In the last 4 years, it has been very crucial to some of us in the United States to know of the greater openness of our neighbor to the north. Glad you were there. I hope that we'll be able to dance better together during the next 4 years.
Amen.
Thank you for right now being a great dance partner, dancing in the earthquakes. And thanks very much. And going forth in the next week and in Kislev, be well, everybody.
Yeah. Shavua Tov. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. And Shavua Tov and Chodesh Tov. כן, יישר כוח. Indeed, יישר כוח.
Thank you.
יישר כוח.
Arthur.
Thank you. Be well.
שבת שלום. שבוע טוב. ביי ביי.
So long.